Hi everyone, I'm Claire Batkin from Your OT Tutor and welcome to day 4 of the Clinical Educator Resource Kit 5-Day Challenge. Today I'll give you some ideas for how to create a scaffolded self-directed learning activity for your students that not only allows you to see how their clinical reasoning is developing, but also allows them to apply what they've been learning while they're not put on the spot in front of a client. And the best bit, this resource will get you some guilt-free, student-free time. Let's get into it. So step number 1 is some brainstorming time. So first you need to decide what type of case study or resource will be based on. So the easiest way to do this is to do some brainstorming and just idea dump all your thoughts onto a mind map, whiteboard or post-it notes. Think about what are the common OT processes followed in your workplace. It could be completing an initial assessment or doing a standardized assessment, prescribing a type of AT, or delivering a therapy or education session to your client. It could even be based on a specific skill that is essential in your workplace, such as communication with clients or other health professionals. Step number 2 is to map out the steps of the process. So for whatever activity you've chosen, map out the steps of that process. Don't forget to start right back at the planning stage and to include all the little steps that you probably do automatically without thinking, but which should be explicitly pointed out to a student. As you do this, have a particular client in mind that will form the basis of your case study. So here's an example to help you out. So my case study is Mrs. D, who has Parkinson's disease. The activity that I've chosen is focused around outlining the steps involved in completing an initial assessment with Mrs. D. So for this type of activity, the steps that I include in my outline could include pre-assessment steps, including gathering information from the referral and other sources, and planning what my initial assessment will involve. Things that happen during the assessment, such as content you will cover in an interview, standardized assessments that you might complete, who else you might speak to, and some skills that might be needed, such as communication or cultural capability. Follow-up that happens immediately after the session, which could be just note writing or liaising with others, and then some long-term planning, including mapping out the types of assessments and interventions that are likely to be needed for Mrs. D in the future. So that was just some examples. And then the next step for step number 3 is to turn the process into questions. So now that you've got the steps marked out, they need to be turned into questions that will prompt the students to consider different aspects of the clinical reasoning involved in the process. So before you get too carried away though, just think about the depth of these questions. It may be that you have a simpler version intended for junior students and a more in-depth version for senior students. If your chosen activity is huge, consider whether you need to cover the whole process in one case study or split it up into a series of case study sections so the student isn't confronted with a 10-page case study to work through. So I'll give you some examples of my questions and you'll notice there's lots of what, how and why questions. And we'll just go back to Mrs. D again. So for example, for the pre-assessment process, your questions could be, is there enough information in the referral? If not, how could you find out more information? Or what paperwork will you need to bring out with you during the home visit? And then for the long-term follow-up, a simple question for junior students could be something like, what types of interventions might we need to do with Mrs. D in the future? And if you wanted to make this a little bit more complex for senior students, you could add some further details. So it could be, what types of interventions might we need to do with Mrs. D in the future? Prioritise your list, giving reasons for why you have listed them in that order, and comment on some factors that may stop you from being able to deliver these interventions in the order that you have planned. Okay, we'll keep going to step number 4, which is to come up with a cheat sheet. So while I always recommend you go through the answers to your case study with the student so you can see their clinical reasoning in action, it may not be something that you can do yourself for every resource. So it could be that a different supervisor will chat through the answers, or if there are multiple students on site, they could even discuss their answers with peers. So either way, if you've got a cheat sheet that has some pre-prepared answers or discussion points, the students will be able to get some feedback on their work, even if you're not available. So what you'll end up with is a document with some case study info and a list of questions that the students need to answer, and then you'll have another version which has the same dot point questions and answers under each question. So here's an example for what I mean. So for question about what paperwork will you need to bring out for the home visit, your dot point answers could be, students might say they'd grab an initial assessment welcome pack, so they should list the items it contains. The paperwork includes welcome letter, contact details for their OT, service agreement to sign, photo consent form to sign, FAQs sheet about the OT services, and a copy of our complaints process. You could make this question a little bit more difficult by asking what do they do if they're out on the visit and realise they'd forgotten one of those resources. So you get the idea, hopefully. So you need to think about the key things that you want your student to understand about the process and the decisions they might need to make. Then step number 5 is to test it out. So just like the last resource, think about who your target audience is and get them to give it a go. Just because your case study makes sense to you as a writer doesn't mean it will make sense to your students. So if you don't have a student on placement, you could even get a new grad to take a look if you've got one of those. Once they've had a go, get their feedback. So was it too easy or too hard? Did it just not make sense at all and more information about the case study person was needed? Or did it give them some aha moments? Or would they rate it as being a useful experience or too much like a uni assignment? So take their feedback on board and keep in mind that what one student loves, another could potentially hate, but make any changes needed and then add it to your resource kit. So these are really great scaffolded activities for students to either work through in their self-directed learning time or with a peer. So woohoo, you're on the home straight. Only one more resource left to create in this 5-day challenge. So if you're loving the resources but starting to understand just how long they can take to create, then now might be a good time to check out the Clinical Educator Starter Kit. There's nothing more valuable than your time, and this kit may help you get some of that time back during your next student placement. And just a little PS, if you'd like to see an example of one of the self-directed learning resources I've got in my kit, then you can check out this bonus YouTube video where I take you through a case study activity related to equipment prescription. We'll see you tomorrow for day 5.